The radio message came through at 0300 hours, and the tone alone told the American colonel something had gone very wrong. "Sir, this is Green Beret Team Alpha. We have a situation. The Canadians found the ambush site, all 6 of them, and they left us a note." Colonel David Harrison, commanding officer of the 5th Special Forces Group at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, stared at the radio handset for a long moment before responding. "Say again, Captain. What do you mean they left you a note?" The captain's voice carried a mixture of embarrassment and disbelief. "Sir, we set up 6 separate ambush positions along the Canadian patrol route. Standard offer tactics, concealed positions, claymores rigged with training charges, the works. The Canadians walked past every single position without triggering any of them. Then they circled back and left notes at each site. Written notes, sir, detailing exactly what was wrong with each position and how they spotted it. This was happening in late August 1966 at Fort Bragg during a joint training exercise between U.S. Army Special Forces and the Canadian Airborne Regiment. The exercise had been designed to test American ambush tactics against a highly trained opposing force, and the Canadians had been invited to provide realistic opposition for Green Beret teams preparing for deployment to Vietnam. While both nations' forces did conduct joint training and Canadian forces did possess exceptional fieldcraft skills, this specific exercise and the events described have been created to examine the different tactical approaches and combat experiences that shaped how these forces operated. The joint exercise had been planned for months. American Special Forces were rotating through Vietnam continuously, conducting reconnaissance missions, training indigenous forces, and running combat operations in jungle terrain where conventional tactics often failed. The training at Fort Bragg was meant to prepare teams for the specific challenges of operating in Vietnam, setting ambushes, avoiding enemy patrols, surviving in hostile territory where any mistake could be fatal. The Canadian Airborne Regiment, based at Edmonton, Alberta, had been invited to participate as the opposing force because Canadian soldiers had developed a reputation for exceptional fieldcraft and tactical proficiency. While Canada wasn't officially involved in combat operations in Vietnam, Canadian forces had been conducting their own training for potential deployment to various global trouble spots, and that training had produced soldiers with skills that American planners thought would provide realistic opposition for Green Beret teams. What nobody on the American side had fully appreciated was that Canadian forces brought specific experiences and tactical approaches that were fundamentally different from American methods, and those differences were about to create an educational experience that the Green Berets would remember for the rest of their careers. The exercise scenario was straightforward. 6 Green Beret teams, each consisting of 12 highly trained Special Forces soldiers, would establish ambush positions along routes that a Canadian patrol would likely use. The Canadians would send a patrol of approximately 30 soldiers through the area. The Green Berets' mission was to ambush the Canadian patrol using realistic tactics without being detected before springing the ambush. This was bread and butter special operations training. Green Berets practiced ambush tactics constantly because ambushes were one of their primary offensive operations in Vietnam. The teams setting up for this exercise had collective decades of experience. Some had already completed tours in Vietnam, others had trained indigenous forces in Laos and Thailand. They were professionals who knew their craft. The Canadian patrol was commanded by Captain Michel Rousseau, a 34-year-old officer from Quebec who'd been in the Canadian Army since 1952. Rousseau had served with Canadian forces in peacekeeping operations in Cyprus and the Middle East, had completed Canadian Airborne qualification, and had trained extensively in survival and fieldcraft in the Canadian wilderness. His patrol consisted of soldiers similarly experienced in operating in difficult terrain with minimal support. What made the Canadian approach different from American methods wasn't better equipment or superior physical conditioning. The Canadians had standard infantry weapons and gear that was generally less sophisticated than what the Green Berets carried. What the Canadians had was a tactical philosophy shaped by different experiences and different assumptions about how combat operations should be conducted. American Special Forces doctrine in 1966 emphasized aggressive action, fire superiority, and the use of technology and firepower to overcome enemy resistance. Green Berets in Vietnam operated with substantial support. Helicopter gunships, artillery, airstrikes could all be called upon if operations went wrong. The tactical approach reflected this support structure. Be aggressive, make contact with the enemy, bring overwhelming firepower to bear. Canadian tactical doctrine, particularly in the Airborne Regiment, emphasized stealth, patient observation, and avoiding contact unless absolutely necessary. Canadian forces trained for operations where they might not have support, where calling for help wasn't an option, where survival depended on not being detected in the first place. This created a different tactical mindset focused on reconnaissance, careful movement, and constant awareness of the tactical environment. These different approaches were about to collide in a training exercise that would challenge American assumptions about their tactical superiority. The exercise began at dawn on August 23, 1966. The Green Beret teams had infiltrated their ambush positions during the night, using night vision equipment and careful route selection to reach their designated areas without detection. Each team had selected positions that provided good fields of fire, concealment from observation, and covered routes for withdrawal after the ambush was sprung. The positions were professionally prepared. Claymores were emplaced and oriented to cover likely avenues of approach. Machine guns were sighted to provide interlocking fire across the kill zone. Individual fighting positions were camouflaged and prepared with overhead cover. Each ambush site represented textbook Special Forces tactics executed by experienced soldiers. The Canadian Patrol began their movement at 0800 hours, 30 soldiers moving in tactical formation through the pine forests of Fort Bragg, heading along a route that would take them through or near all 6 ambush sites. The patrol was being observed by exercise controllers and was being tracked by American headquarters to monitor when they would hit the first ambush. What the Canadian Patrol did in the first 30 minutes of movement established a pattern that would continue throughout the exercise. They moved slowly. Extraordinarily slowly by American standards. The point man would advance perhaps 20 meters, then stop and observe for several minutes before signaling the next soldier forward. The patrol covered less than 1 kilometer in the first hour. American observers watching from the exercise control center were puzzled by the Canadian pace. "Why are they moving so slowly?" one staff officer asked. "At this rate, they'll barely make it through a quarter of the route by end of exercise." An older American sergeant who'd worked with Canadian forces before had a different perspective. "They're reading the terrain. Every time they stop, they're looking at what's ahead, what's to the sides, where an ambush might be. They're not trying to cover distance, they're trying to survive." This patient, methodical approach was exactly what allowed the Canadians to spot the first American ambush position. The point man, a corporal named Jean Thibault from New Brunswick, halted the patrol approximately 50 meters from the first Green Beret position. He spent 5 minutes observing the terrain ahead through binoculars, then signaled Captain Rousseau forward. "Sir, there's something wrong with that tree line ahead," Thibault said quietly, pointing to the area where the American position was concealed. "The vegetation looks wrong. Some of the branches are broken in ways that don't match the prevailing wind. And there's a slight depression in the ground that could be a fighting position." Rousseau looked through his own binoculars, studying the area Thibault had indicated. The American ambush position. Baf, staying outside the effective range of the claymores and maintaining observation on the suspicious area. Once they were past the kill zone, Rousseau sent 2 soldiers to conduct a closer reconnaissance of the position, while the rest of the patrol provided security. The 2 Canadian soldiers approached the American position from an angle that wasn't covered by the ambush setup. They observed the Green Beret position for 10 minutes from concealment, identifying the locations of the claymores, the fighting positions, and the fields of fire. Then, they withdrew without being detected by the Americans, who were still focused on the main patrol route. This pattern repeated at the second ambush site. The Canadian point element spotted indicators that suggested an ambush, disturbed ground where fighting positions had been dug. Branches that had been cut and positioned as camouflage but didn't quite match the natural vegetation pattern, a slight trail where American soldiers had approached their positions. Each time, the Canadians identified the ambush, marked its location, and bypassed it without triggering the engagement. By the third ambush site, the American teams were starting to realize something unusual was happening. The Canadian patrol should have hit at least 1 ambush by now, but they kept detouring around the prepared positions. The Green Beret team commander at the third site radioed headquarters. "Sir, I think the Canadians are deliberately avoiding our positions. They're not walking into the kill zones." Colonel Harrison, monitoring the exercise from the operations center, was skeptical. "Captain, your position is well concealed, and you're using proper ambush tactics. There's no way the Canadians can see you from the patrol route. They're probably just taking a circuitous route for tactical reasons." "Sir, with respect, I don't think that's what's happening. They stopped about 75 meters from our position, spent 10 minutes observing, then deliberately routed around us. It looked like they knew we were here." Harrison reviewed the exercise plan and the positions of all 6 ambush sites. If they'd actually spotted the ambush positions, that would suggest a level of tactical awareness that exceeded what Harrison had expected from the opposing force. He made a decision. All teams, maintain your positions and continue the exercise. Let's see if the Canadians can actually find all 6 sites. What happened over the next several hours was a masterclass in fieldcraft and tactical observation that would become legendary in Special Forces training circles. The Canadian Patrol not only avoided all 6 ambush positions, but conducted detailed reconnaissance of each one, documenting the American positions without being detected. At the 4th ambush site, the Canadian approach demonstrated how fundamentally different their tactical philosophy was from American methods. The Green Beret team at this position was commanded by Captain Thomas Brady, a veteran of 2 tours in Vietnam who'd conducted dozens of successful ambushes against Viet Cong forces. His position was, in his professional judgment, perfectly prepared, but when the Canadian Patrol approached, they identified his position using indicators that Brady hadn't considered. A Canadian sergeant named William Mackenzie noticed that birds in the area where the American position was located weren't behaving naturally. The birds were avoiding a particular section of the tree line, suggesting human presence. He also noticed that a small stream running through the area had been disturbed upstream from where it should have been if the terrain was unoccupied. These subtle environmental indicators, combined with careful observation of the vegetation and terrain, allowed the Canadians to pinpoint the American position. They bypassed it, conducted reconnaissance from a concealed location, and moved on. At the 5th ambush site, the Canadian Patrol encountered the most professionally prepared American position of the exercise. The Green Beret team had established their ambush in a natural choke point where the patrol route passed through dense vegetation with limited alternative routes. The position itself was excellently camouflaged and was sighted to catch the patrol in a classic L-shaped ambush. The Canadian point man halted the patrol well short of the choke point. "Sir, that's an obvious ambush location," he reported to Captain Rousseau. "If we were setting an ambush, that's where we'd do it." Rousseau agreed. "We're not going through there. Find us an alternate route that keeps us outside machine gun range of that position." The Canadians detoured through terrain that was more difficult but safer, adding an hour to their movement time, but avoiding the American ambush entirely. After they'd passed, a 4-man Canadian team backtracked to observe the American position, confirmed its location and setup, and documented it for their after-action report. By the time the Canadian Patrol approached the 6th and final ambush position, the American teams were experiencing a mixture of professional respect and frustration. Their carefully prepared positions hadn't been triggered because the Canadians weren't walking into them. The opposition force was operating with a level of tactical awareness that made the American ambush tactics ineffective. The 6th ambush site was the most elaborate of all. The Green Beret team had spent hours preparing it, creating a complex position with multiple layers of claymores, carefully camouflaged fighting positions, and withdrawal routes that would allow them to disengage if the ambush went wrong. The team commander, a major named Robert Clayton, who was one of the most experienced Special Forces officers at Fort Bragg, was confident that this position was undetectable. The Canadian Patrol spotted it within 5 minutes of entering the area. A combination of unnatural vegetation patterns, disturbed earth that hadn't been properly camouflaged, and the presence of communication wire that was visible for a brief section where it crossed an open area all indicated American presence. The Canadians marked the position, bypassed it, and continued their patrol. At this point, the exercise controllers called a halt to the patrol phase and directed both forces to return to base for the after-action review. The American teams extracted from their positions, frustrated that they hadn't been able to execute a single ambush. The Canadian Patrol returned, having successfully avoided detection and having identified all 6 American positions. The after-action review took place that evening in a classroom at Fort Bragg. Present were the American teams, the Canadian Patrol, exercise controllers, and senior officers, including Colonel Harrison. The atmosphere was tense because the results had challenged American assumptions about their tactical capabilities. Harrison opened the meeting by addressing the results directly. "Gentlemen, the Canadians successfully identified and avoided all 6 ambush positions without triggering any of them. This is not the result we expected, and we need to understand how this happened and what we can learn from it." He turned to Captain Rousseau. "Captain, walk us through how you spotted our positions." Rousseau stood and moved to the map board at the front of the room. He had prepared a detailed briefing on exactly how each American position had been identified, and what he presented was an education in fieldcraft that most of the Americans in the room had never received. "The first position we identified was here," Rousseau pointed to the map. "Our point man noticed that branches in the tree line were broken in patterns that didn't match natural wind damage. He also observed that the ground in this area had a slight depression that could indicate a fighting position. We marked it as a possible ambush and detoured around it. After we passed, we sent a reconnaissance team to confirm. They observed your position from concealment and identified 6 fighting positions, 4 claymores, and 2 machine gun positions. The position was well prepared, but the camouflage had several indicators that revealed human activity. He went through each of the 6 positions in similar detail, explaining the specific indicators that had allowed the Canadians to identify each site: broken branches, disturbed earth, unnatural vegetation patterns, changes in animal and bird behavior, communication wire visibility, ground wear from soldiers moving to and from positions. With each explanation, the American officers in the room became more uncomfortable. These weren't sophisticated detection techniques requiring special equipment. They were basic fieldcraft observations that any well-trained soldier should be capable of making. So the fact that the Green Berets had been defeated by these simple techniques suggested gaps in their training and tactical awareness. After Rousseau finished his briefing, there was silence in the room. Finally, Major Clayton, the officer who'd commanded the 6th ambush position, spoke up. "Captain Rousseau, your briefing suggests that our positions were poorly camouflaged and that we made basic fieldcraft errors. I disagree with that assessment. My team used standard Special Forces camouflage techniques that have proven effective in combat operations in Vietnam." Rousseau nodded respectfully. "Major, I don't mean to suggest that your techniques were poor or that your soldiers were unprofessional. But the techniques that work against Viet Cong forces operating in one tactical environment may not work against forces trained to operate in different environments with different detection methods. My soldiers are trained to operate in Canadian wilderness where there's no support available, where calling for help isn't an option, and where survival depends on not being detected in the first place. That training creates a different tactical approach focused on patience, observation, and treating every piece of terrain as potentially hostile." One of the American captains asked the question that was on everyone's mind. "You mentioned that your team left notes at each of our positions. What was in those notes?" Rousseau looked slightly embarrassed. "That was perhaps inappropriate given this was a training exercise with Allied forces, but after we identified each position, we left detailed notes explaining what indicators had revealed the position and what improvements could be made to the camouflage and position preparation. We intended it as constructive feedback, not as mockery." The American captain smiled slightly. "Can we see those notes?" The exercise controllers had collected the notes from each position, and they were distributed to the American teams. The notes were detailed, professional, and exactly as Rousseau had described: constructive criticism pointing out specific camouflage errors and tactical mistakes. The note from the first position read, "Your position was revealed by the following indicators. 1. Branches broken at unnatural angles suggesting human activity. 2. Ground depression visible from 50 meters suggesting fighting position. 3. Claymore wires visible at ground level where vegetation had been cleared. Recommendations: match vegetation disturbance to natural patterns, ensure fighting positions don't create visible depressions, conceal wires with natural ground cover. Well-selected position otherwise. Respect, Canadian Airborne Regiment." Each note followed a similar pattern: specific problems identified, specific recommendations for improvement, professional tone throughout. The Americans reading them had to acknowledge that the feedback was accurate and valuable, even though receiving it from the opposing force after a failed exercise was professionally humbling. Colonel Harrison let the American teams read the notes, then addressed the room. "This exercise didn't go the way we planned, but it's provided us with valuable lessons. The Canadian patrol demonstrated fieldcraft and tactical awareness at a level that defeated our ambush tactics. Rather than being defensive about this, we need to learn from it and incorporate these lessons into our training." He turned to Rousseau. "Would you and your soldiers be willing to conduct training sessions with our teams on the techniques you use to identify our positions? We clearly have some gaps in our fieldcraft that need to be addressed before teams deploy to Vietnam." Rousseau agreed, and over the following week, Canadian soldiers conducted extensive training sessions with the Green Beret teams. The training covered topics that American Special Forces had either not emphasized or had not learned to the depth the Canadians possessed: reading vegetation patterns to identify human disturbance, using animal and bird behavior as early warning indicators, moving through terrain in ways that minimized detectable traces, camouflaging positions to match natural patterns rather than simply concealing them. The American soldiers, once they got over the initial embarrassment of being taught by forces they had assumed were less experienced, absorbed the training eagerly. Many of the Green Berets were heading to Vietnam, where these skills could mean the difference between successful missions, and ambushes that ended with American casualties. Pride mattered less than survival. The training sessions also revealed why Canadian forces had developed such sophisticated fieldcraft skills. The Canadians trained for operations in wilderness environments where environmental conditions were harsh, where extraction wasn't always possible, and where small teams had to survive for extended periods without support. A Canadian soldier might spend 2 weeks in the wilderness on an exercise with minimal supplies, learning to move undetected and to read the environment for threats. American Special Forces trained for similar operations, but their training often assumed that support was available: helicopters for extraction, artillery for fire support, airstrikes if things went wrong. This assumption, while reasonable given American military capabilities, created subtle differences in how soldiers approached tactical problems. The Canadians trained as if support wasn't coming. The Americans trained as if it usually would. One of the most valuable training sessions focused on patience and observation. A Canadian instructor, Sergeant William Mackenzie, who'd been part of the patrol that identified the ambush positions, explained the Canadian approach. "We assume that every piece of terrain could contain an ambush. We assume that rushing forward will get us killed. So we move slowly, we observe constantly, and we don't advance until we understand what's ahead of us. This is frustrating because progress is slow, but slow progress where everyone survives is better than fast progress where people die." An American sergeant major asked, "But in Vietnam, we can't always afford to move that slowly. Sometimes mission timelines require covering distance quickly. But I'd suggest that the speed you gain by moving quickly through terrain without proper observation is often lost when you walk into an ambush and have to fight your way out. Taking an extra hour to move carefully through a danger area might save days of dealing with casualties and compromised operations." This philosophy, prioritizing survival over speed, wasn't entirely new to American Special Forces, but the emphasis the Canadians placed on it and the techniques they'd developed to implement it provided new tools for American teams to consider. The joint training exercise that had started as an embarrassing failure for American forces ended up becoming one of the most valuable training events the Green Berets at Fort Bragg experienced that year. The lessons learned were documented and distributed to Special Forces units throughout the Army. Some of the techniques the Canadians taught were incorporated into the formal Special Forces training curriculum. More importantly, the exercise challenged American assumptions about tactical superiority. The Green Berets had been operating with the confidence that they were the best-trained special operations forces in the world. The Canadian patrol had demonstrated that other forces, operating with different philosophies and different skill sets, could be equally or more effective in specific tactical contexts. This recognition that American forces didn't have a monopoly on tactical excellence was professionally valuable. It created openness to learning from Allied forces and to incorporating foreign techniques when they proved effective. The willingness to learn from the Canadians rather than being defensive about being defeated by them reflected professional military culture at its best. For the Canadian forces, the exercise validated their training approaches and demonstrated that Canadian tactical methods could compete with or exceed those of larger Allied militaries. The Canadian Airborne Regiment's reputation for fieldcraft excellence was enhanced, and the techniques they'd demonstrated at Fort Bragg became part of Canadian military folklore. The story of "We found your trap" became legendary in both American and Canadian military circles, told and retold with varying degrees of embellishment. The core narrative remained consistent. Canadian forces had defeated Green Beret ambush tactics through superior fieldcraft and tactical awareness, then had generously shared their knowledge to help American forces improve. Captain Rousseau, the Canadian officer who'd commanded the patrol, later reflected on the exercise in an interview with a Canadian military journal. "We weren't trying to embarrass the Americans. We were conducting the exercise as realistically as we could, using the techniques our soldiers are trained to use. The fact that those techniques proved effective against American ambush tactics was professionally satisfying. But the most valuable outcome was that both forces learned from the experience and improved their capabilities." For Colonel Harrison and the American Special Forces community at Fort Bragg, the exercise became a teaching example about the importance of continuous learning and about not assuming that any single approach to tactics is universally superior. In subsequent exercises, American teams incorporated Canadian techniques and found that their ambush detection and avoidance capabilities improved measurably. Some of the Green Berets who participated in the exercise and the follow-on training with Canadian forces later credited those lessons with saving their lives in Vietnam. The techniques for identifying ambush positions, for reading terrain, For moving patiently through dangerous areas, these skills proved directly applicable to the tactical challenges they faced in Southeast Asian jungles. The broader lesson from the Fort Bragg exercise was about the value of Allied military cooperation and the importance of mutual learning. No single military force possesses all tactical knowledge. Different forces develop different capabilities based on their unique experiences and operational requirements. When allies are willing to share knowledge and learn from each other, all forces become more capable. The embarrassment the Green Berets initially felt about being defeated by the Canadian patrol gave way to professional respect and genuine appreciation for the training they received. The Canadians, for their part, gained confidence that their tactical approaches were world-class and that Canadian soldiers could operate effectively alongside or against any military force. The exercise at Fort Bragg in August 1966 was a small event in the larger context of the Vietnam War and Cold War military operations. It demonstrated that excellence in military operations comes in many forms, that pride must be balanced with willingness to learn, and that sometimes the best training comes from being defeated by forces you didn't expect could defeat you.